The morning air was cold and biting as Jonathan Drake stood at the entrance of his immense property, adjusting the oversized hoodie that hung loosely over his frame. It carried a faint smell of mothballs, a relic from a distant past that he had unearthed for this experiment. His sneakers were worn down to the soles, scuffed and torn, a stark contrast to the polished leather shoes he typically wore to meetings. The billionaire tech mogul had traded his world of tailored suits and sleek interfaces for an old coffee cup and a quiet spot on the sidewalk outside his Mercer Island mansion. From where he stood, the property loomed like a fortress, a glass and steel masterpiece perched atop impeccably manicured lawns, with its private dock and a gleaming view of Lake Washington. To the world, it was the pinnacle of success. But to Jonathan, it was beginning to feel like a gilded cage, cutting him off from the struggles of the real world. He glanced at the cup in his hands, a simple piece of cardboard now repurposed as a begging tool. The irony wasn't lost on him. For years, his coffee habits had been a status symbol, always custom-made blends served in luxury cafes. Today, it was a symbol of survival. Jonathan sighed as a memory from his childhood flashed through his mind. Growing up in Detroit had been a constant struggle. He could still hear his mother's voice urging him to ignore the stares of passers-by when they couldn't afford to pay the gas bill or buy groceries. That had fueled his determination to rise to the top, but as he stood there, he wondered if he had left something essential behind. The idea for this social experiment had struck him during a company gala. Surrounded by people congratulating him on his latest AI innovation, he overheard a whispered comment about how untouchable he seemed. It wasn't the compliment they thought, it was a reminder of how far removed he had become from his roots. And so, here he was, standing in the morning mist, ready to become invisible in his own neighborhood. Jonathan crouched near the gate, positioning himself on the cold pavement. He placed the cup in front of him and waited. The first few moments felt like hours. A jogger passed by, earbuds firmly in place, not sparing him a glance. Then came a man in a tailored suit, walking his Labrador retriever. Jonathan straightened up, lifting the cup slightly in a subtle plea for attention. But the man tugged on the dog's leash, crossing to the other side of the street as though Jonathan carried a contagious disease. Jonathan's stomach tightened. The indifference was immediate, but it stung more than he had expected. He reminded himself that it was all an act, but the pavement beneath him felt all too real, hard, unyielding, and cold. Across the street, a mother hurried her young child along, whispering something Jonathan couldn't hear. The boy turned back to stare, his wide eyes filled with curiosity, but the mother pulled him forward. Jonathan let out a slow sigh. "So this is what it's like," he murmured to himself, his voice low enough to be carried away by the wind. He shifted his position, feeling the ache in his knees from sitting on the ground. A sports car roared past, the driver's laughter echoing as he leaned toward the passenger seat, pointing at something, at him. The laughter lingered in the air long after the car disappeared around the corner. For the first time in years, Jonathan Drake felt small. And as the sun began to rise, illuminating his mansion behind him, he realized this was only the beginning of the longest day he'd had in a very long time. The sun rose slowly over Mercer Island, casting a soft light on the quiet street. Jonathan Drake adjusted himself on the cold ground, trying to ignore the ache in his back and the stiffness in his legs. He wasn't used to such discomfort. For years, his daily routine had started with gourmet coffee and ergonomic chairs in sleek offices, not with rough concrete and the indifference of strangers. The street began to come to life. A couple passed within a few feet of him, chatting animatedly. The moment they noticed his presence, their laughter stopped. The woman cast a quick sideways glance, but the man quickened his pace, pulling her by the hand as if avoiding Jonathan was a matter of survival. Jonathan tried to convince himself this was expected, but the knot in his throat told him otherwise. He took a deep breath and looked around. A young athletic man was jogging toward him, his headphones firmly in place, completely absorbed in his own routine. Jonathan raised the cup hesitantly, hoping to catch his attention. For a brief moment, the jogger glanced in his direction, but the vacant look in his eyes made it clear he had no intention of stopping. "It's as if I'm not even here," Jonathan thought, feeling the weight of those interactions. The experiment was beginning to test not only his patience but also his emotional resilience. Moments later, a group of teenagers appeared, backpacks slung over their shoulders and loud laughter echoing down the street. One of them looked at Jonathan and pointed, murmuring something to the others. The laughter grew louder. One of them even mimicked the gesture of holding out a cup, mocking Jonathan as they passed by. Jonathan lowered his head, trying to control his frustration. He knew this was part of the test, but the experience was revealing something he hadn't expected. Even with the knowledge of his wealth and power, he felt vulnerable, exposed, and smaller than he had ever felt before. As the day progressed, the street became busier, but the interactions followed the same pattern: quick glances, hurried steps, and no help. Jonathan began to reflect on what it meant to be ignored. During his youth in Detroit, he remembered asking neighbors for help and facing doors that never opened. Now, he saw the same behavior repeating itself, but it felt even more brutal, coming from people who lived alongside his opulent mansion. He was about to give up, planning to head back inside and end the experiment, when something unusual caught his attention. Across the street, an old, rusted car pulled up with a loud screech. The driver's door opened, revealing a middle-aged woman with grey hair tied in a simple bun. She wore a worn coat but walked with steady steps. Jonathan watched as she looked in his direction, her face showing genuine concern. She crossed the street, approaching without hesitation, ignoring the stark contrast between the grandeur of the mansion behind him and the simplicity of her own appearance. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with empathy. Jonathan hesitated for a moment, trying to maintain his neutral expression. "Just trying to survive," he replied, keeping up his disguise. The woman opened her purse and pulled out a few crumpled dollar bills, handing them to him with a gentle smile. "It's not much, but I hope it helps," she said. "You shouldn't have to go through this alone." Jonathan remained silent for a few seconds, struggling to find words. "Thank you," he finally said, feeling a tightness in his chest he couldn't quite explain. "Don't give up," the woman said, lightly placing her hand on his shoulder before heading back to her car. "The world can be cruel, but there will always be someone willing to help." Jonathan watched her drive away, the sound of the rusty engine fading into the distance. For a moment, he sat still, staring at the crumpled bills in his hand. Amid so many displays of indifference, that woman had become a symbol of hope. Jonathan barely had time to stuff the crumpled bills into his pocket before Kara, his assistant, approached with quick strides. She stopped a few feet away, her expression shifting from confusion to one of recognition. "Jonathan?" she asked, almost in a whisper, staring at the man sitting on the ground. He couldn't help a faint smile, feeling a little embarrassed at being discovered. "Hi, Kara," he replied, his voice low and hesitant. Kara crossed her arms, tilting her head in the way she always did when trying to figure out something complex. What are you doing out here dressed like that? And sitting on the ground? In front of your own house?" Jonathan sighed and stood up, stretching his legs, numb from sitting on the concrete for so long. "I needed to see things from a different perspective," he explained. "I needed to understand how people really see someone in a situation like this." She studied him for a moment, as if deciding whether to scold him or encourage him. Finally, she shook her head and said, "This seems like something only you would do." Jonathan let out a weak laugh. "It's a bit extreme, I know. But honestly, it's been revealing. Most people don't even look at me. Some avoid me as if I'm invisible, or worse, as if I'm a nuisance." Kara sat down beside him on the ground, something Jonathan hadn't expected. "I imagine it's been hard," she said. "But also, well, what did you expect? Not everyone has the courage to face suffering head-on." Jonathan glanced sideways at her. "Do you think it's fear? Fear? Guilt? Indifference?" "I think it depends," Kara replied. "But we can't forget that some people do care. Like that woman who stopped to help you." Jonathan nodded, remembering Martha and her kind words. "She reminded me that there's still hope, even in the worst circumstances." Kara smiled softly. "You know, it makes me think of when I was in college. I almost didn't make it through because I couldn't afford books or food. It was a woman in the library, someone I didn't even know, who helped me. Without her, I wouldn't be here today." Jonathan looked at her with renewed attention. He knew Kara as a dedicated and efficient employee, but this story revealed a side of her he'd never explored. "Why didn't you ever tell me that?" "You never asked," Kara replied, laughing lightly. "But the point is, acts of kindness have an effect that goes beyond the moment. That woman doesn't even know the impact she had on my life. And maybe that lady who helped you will never know the impact she's had on yours." Jonathan remained silent for a moment, absorbing her words. "I think I've spent too much time focusing on things that are too big, building systems, creating innovations, but maybe I've forgotten the power of simple things, like extending a hand to someone." Kara stood up and held out her hand to him. "Well, maybe it's time to use everything you have to change that." Jonathan took her hand, slowly rising to his feet. He looked at his mansion in the background, as imposing as ever, but now it seemed different. A symbol of opulence he had built, but one that wasn't truly connected to the world around it. Jonathan spent the following days immersed in a mix of reflection and planning. The conversation with Kara and his encounter with Martha had left a deep mark on him. For the first time in years, he felt he had more questions than answers. But instead of ignoring them as he had before, he decided to confront them. On Monday morning, Jonathan was back in the office, but something about his demeanor had changed. He called a meeting with his leadership team, a rare move for him. When everyone was gathered, he addressed them with a determination that blended confidence and vulnerability. "I've realized something important," he began, his voice calm but firm. "For a long time, our company has created solutions to improve efficiency and make life easier, but in a way that often overlooks the most vulnerable. I want to change that. I want our next major initiative to focus on real social impact." The executives exchanged glances, clearly surprised. One of them raised a hand. "Jonathan, what exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing," he replied, "that our company invests in technology and projects that directly benefit underserved communities. I want to start here, in Seattle. We're going to work with local organizations to support the homeless, veterans, and people in vulnerable situations. If we're not helping solve real problems, what's the point of all this?" The room fell silent for a moment before Kara, sitting at the back, gave a small smile and nodded. The following week, Jonathan made it a priority to visit local shelters to meet the people who would be impacted by his new vision. At one of these shelters, he encountered Martha again, this time as a volunteer, helping to serve meals. "You," she exclaimed, surprised to see him well-dressed and with a completely different demeanor. Jonathan smiled, embarrassed but genuine. "It's me. I wanted to thank you for that day. You gave me something I didn't even know I needed." Martha shook her head. "I only did what anyone should do. How are you?" "Much better, thanks to you. And now, I want to help, just like you did." The two spent some time talking, and Jonathan listened attentively to Martha's stories about her experience as a war veteran and how small acts of kindness had helped her through difficult times. He left the shelter with a renewed sense of purpose. In the months that followed, Jonathan implemented a series of changes within his company. He established a philanthropic fund focused on supporting veterans, the homeless, and affordable housing initiatives. Beyond that, he encouraged his employees to volunteer, offering financial and logistical support to those who wanted to contribute. His mansion, once merely a symbol of wealth, began hosting events to raise funds and develop strategies for the projects. He transformed the space of opulence into a place of connection and change. On a rainy morning, as he walked through a street in Seattle, Jonathan spotted a man sitting at a corner with a paper cup in front of him. He paused for a moment, observing the scene that had once been so familiar. Without hesitation, he stepped into a nearby coffee shop, bought a hot coffee, and returned. Handing it to the man, he said, "You shouldn't have to go through this alone." As he walked away, Jonathan felt a smile forming on his face. He knew he couldn't change the entire world, but he could start with small acts of kindness. And, in doing so, perhaps inspire others to do the same. Jonathan looked out at the Seattle skyline, the lights glimmering through the rain. For the first time, he felt he was using his wealth for something that truly mattered. True wealth, he finally understood, wasn't what you accumulated but what you shared.
If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel. It means a lot to us and helps us continue creating videos and spreading messages of inspiration and kindness. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day.